exposing prison food, meals that break spirits. The rotten tray. The room went silent the moment the tray hit the table. A green, moldy piece of bread sat next to a scoop of watery beans that smelled like something long dead. One inmate stared at it, his hands shaking, his stomach growling with hunger. He looked around the chow hall. Every tray was the same. Spoiled bread, much that barely looked like food, and a mystery meat no one could name. Then it happened. The man pushed his tray away and shouted, "They're feeding us poison." Others followed, slamming their trays, banging on tables, yelling at the guards. The sound grew louder, echoing like thunder inside the walls. Guards rushed in, batons ready. The prison turned into a storm, all because of a meal. But how did prison food become so bad, so powerful, that it could break the human spirit? Hunger behind bars. To understand this moment, we need to go back. Inside prisons, food is more than just meals. It's power. It decides who stays quiet and who explodes. For many inmates, food is the only thing they can look forward to each day. But here's the truth. Prison food is designed to control, not to nourish. It's cheap, made with the lowest ingredients, and often prepared in filthy kitchens where rats and roaches crawl on the floors. Guards know this. Wardens know this. But to them, it's not about taste. It's about breaking people down. Some days, prisoners get watery oatmeal that tastes like cardboard. Other days, a thin slice of bologna slapped between two stale pieces of bread. No vegetables, no fruit, no choice. Just whatever the system decides to throw on the tray. At first, some prisoners try to laugh it off, joking about the mystery meat or trading food in the yard. But hunger grows. Weakness sets in. Their bodies shrink. Their patience wears thin. And then comes a breaking point. One night in Rikers Island, the kitchen served stew that smelled like gasoline. Inmates claimed it was spoiled. Dozens refused to eat. Some threw their trays at the wall. And when the guards ordered silence, the silence never came. The chow hall erupted into chaos. The chow hall riot. The first tray slammed against the wall, splattering stew across the concrete. Then another. Within seconds, the air was filled with flying food and shouts that rattled the ceiling. "Inedible! This is poison!" someone screamed. Guards charged in, shields raised, batons in hand. They barked orders, but the noise was louder than their voices. Inmates flipped tables. Some stood on benches, fists pumping. The stew wasn't just food anymore. It was a weapon, a symbol of their anger. One prisoner, desperate and shaking, grabbed his tray and hurled it straight at a guard's helmet. The sound of metal on plastic cracked through the room. That single act set off a storm. Guards swung back, batons crashing down. Inmates ducked, ran. Some even shielded themselves with trays. The fight wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about dignity. But when the chaos finally began to die down and the last prisoner was dragged out in cuffs, the truth hit harder than the batons. Nothing had changed. The food would still be there tomorrow. The same slop, the same broken spirits, the kitchen secrets. The next morning, while bruised inmates lined up again, the kitchen told its own story. Behind the steel doors, giant pots boiled with watery soup, the smell sour and heavy. Bags of meat sat thawing on the floor, dripping blood across cracked tiles. Roaches scurried in and out of drains. Workers in hairnets, prisoners themselves, stirred the pots with giant spoons, their faces blank, their hands tired. One of them whispered to another, "This isn't food, man, this is punishment." And he wasn't wrong. The contract for prison meals went to the cheapest bidders. Companies that cut corners, that bought expired products, that made profits from every hungry stomach. To save money, they used fillers instead of real ingredients and mixed powders with water to create fake eggs, fake potatoes, even fake milk. Inmates watched every tray that slid to the slot, their anger building, their bodies weakening. They knew the truth. No one on the outside cared what they ate. And inside, food was no longer right. It was control. And then came the whispers. Whispers that the next meal would make people sick. The sickening meal. The rumor spread like wildfire. Don't eat tonight. It's bad. But hunger doesn't care about rumors. When the trays slid across the counter, men still reached for them. The meal was pale and greasy, a chunk of meatloaf that looked gray under the lights, with a scoop of mashed potatoes so watery they dripped off the side. Some inmates stared at it, pushing the food around, suspicious. Others dug in fast, desperate to fill their stomachs. Minutes later, the coughing started. One man bent over, clutching his stomach. Another groaned, holding his throat, sweat pouring down his face. The chow hall grew quiet, too quiet, as more prisoners dropped their trays and stumbled toward the bathrooms. Guards shouted, dragging sick inmates away, thinking it was all an act. But it wasn't. That night, dozens of men doubled over in pain, vomiting in their cells. The whispers were true. The food wasn't just breaking spirits now. It was breaking bodies. Silence in the cells. By morning, the prison was a tomb. Hallways echoed with coughs. Some men refused breakfast, too scared to eat. The smell of disinfectant mixed with sickness hung in the air. But here's the part no one on the outside ever sees. Complaints about food don't leave the prison walls. When inmates tried to file grievances, the papers went missing. When families called, they were told everything was fine. Inside, silence became the only option. Guards told inmates, "You don't eat, you don't live." And they weren't joking. Skipping meals meant weakness. Weakness meant you couldn't fight, couldn't survive. Still, under the silence, anger simmered. Inmates traded stories in whispers. The meat was expired. The kitchen workers were told to cover the smell with extra salt, and sometimes food was stored so long it turned slimy. Everyone knew another breaking point was coming. And when it came, it would be violent. The breaking point. It started with one man. He refused his tray. He pushed it back across the counter and said, "I'd rather starve." The guard stared at him, cold and silent, then shoved the tray harder, forcing it into his hands. Around him, other prisoners hesitated. Some pushed their trays away too. One by one, the line broke. By the time the guards noticed, half the chow hall was chanting the same words. "We won't eat. We won't eat." The sound shook the walls. For inmates, this was dangerous. Refusing food was like declaring war. But in that moment, hunger and fear were replaced by something stronger, unity. Guards panicked. They called for backup. Riot shields lined the doors. Orders barked through radios. But the chants only grew louder. Some inmates slammed trays onto the ground. Others banged on the tables like drums. And then, just like before, chaos exploded. Tables flipped. Food flew. Trays crashed into shields. And this time, the fight was bigger, louder, and harder to stop. Punishment meals. When the riot was crushed, punishment followed. Guards didn't just take away privileges. They went straight for the stomach. The next day, every inmate was handed the same meal, a cold, hard loaf. It was gray, heavy like a brick, and tasted like raw flour mixed with dirt. They called it the loaf. Officially, it was bread and vegetables mashed together into a block. But everyone knew the truth. It wasn't food. It was punishment disguised as a meal. No flavor. No comfort. Just a reminder, resist the system and you will starve. Some prisoners broke down crying over it. Others tried to swallow, gagging with each bite. The loaf was made to break them, bite by bite, until they give up on rebellion and obey. But a few didn't give in. They swore the loaf wouldn't be the end of their fight. And soon, a plan began to form. The secret plan. The loaf sat like a stone in their stomachs. Every bite was torture. But for some, it did something else. It fueled their rage. Late at night, when the lights dimmed and the guards' footsteps faded, whispers passed from cell to cell. A plan was taking shape. Not with weapons. Not with fists. With food. The idea was simple but dangerous. If the prison used food to control them, they would use food to fight back. Prisoners working in the kitchen were the first link. They knew the schedules, the storage rooms, the shipments. They whispered about rotting meat stacked in the freezer, about powdered milk crawling with bugs, about bread so stale it bent instead of broke. The plan? Expose it, not just to other inmates, but to the outside world. letters smuggled out, families told to call reporters. And inside, a hunger strike, a refusal to eat, even if it meant collapsing in the yard. It was risky, very risky. But in prison, risk was all they had left. Hunger strike. The first morning, it was just a few who left their trays untouched. They sat in silence while guards barked at them to eat. By the second day, dozens joined. By the third day, the chow hall was half empty. The strike spread like wildfire. Some men grew weak and dizzy, stumbling back to their bunks. Others clenched their fists, determined to last as long as it took. Guards grew nervous. Reports flew to warden. Medical staff warned of dehydration and collapse. But the prisoners stayed strong, their hunger turning into power. Then came the retaliation. Water shut off. Commissary closed. Guards stormed cells, shaking down anyone who looked defiant. They thought fear would break the strike. But instead, it sparked something worse. One inmate collapsed in the middle of the yard, his body shaking, his lips dry and cracked. His fall was a signal. The prison erupted once again. Collapse in the yard. The yard froze when the inmate's body hit the ground. His chest heaved, eyes rolling back, lips pale as chalk. For a moment, no one moved. Then shouts filled the air. "Help him. He's dying." Guards rushed in, but instead of care, they came with force, pushing inmates back, barking orders, dragging the man across the dirt like he was nothing more than trash. Prisoners screamed, fists pounding against the fence, the sound of rage echoing across the yard. The hunger strike had gone from protest to crisis. Whispers turned to fury. Fury turned to fire. That night, men in their cells began smashing trays against bars, shouting into the dark. The prison shook with a noise that couldn't be ignored. And for the first time, the warden made a choice. He ordered something even worse than the loaf. Something designed to finish the fight once and for all. The starvation tactic. The next day, breakfast never came. No trays, no lines, nothing. Hours passed. Then more hours. Prisoners pressed their faces to the bars, waiting. But nothing slid through the slots. The warden had turned food into a weapon, this time by taking it away completely. By the second day, without meals, the prison grew weak. Some inmates groaned in their bunks, too drained to move. Others fought each other for scraps hidden under mattresses. Old crackers from commissary, even a half-eaten candy bar smuggled weeks earlier. But hunger is a dangerous fire. The longer it burns, the harder it is to put out. On the third day, something snapped. A group of inmates, desperate and trembling with rage, broke through the chow hall doors. They tore into the kitchen, ripping open cabinets, grabbing anything they could find, flour, sugar, frozen meat. Guards stormed in, batons flying. But this wasn't just a riot. This was survival. The kitchen raid. The kitchen doors burst open, steel hinges screaming as prisoners stormed inside. Pots crashed to the ground. Flour exploded into the air like smoke, and men clawed at shelves for anything edible. Frozen meat slammed onto the floor, packages tearing open to reveal slimy cuts that reeked of rot. Bags of rice spilled like sand, crawling with tiny insects that scattered across the tiles. For a moment, it wasn't about rebellion. It was desperation. Men stuffed food into pockets, shoved stale bread down their shirts, gnawed at frozen patties with their teeth. Hunger had turned them wild. But then the real horror set in. The food they'd stolen wasn't safe. It wasn't fresh. Some meat was green with mold, some vegetables black and slimy, some flour crawling with larvae. Still, men ate. They had no choice. And in that chaos, guards stormed in. Shields slammed, batons cracked, and fists flew. Prisoners clung to scraps of rotten food as if their lives depended on it. The kitchen became a battlefield, not for freedom, not for power, but for survival. And when the smoke cleared, the floor was littered with broken trays, spilled food, and bodies dragged away in chains. But the hunger war was far from over, because word of what happened in that kitchen was about to spread far beyond the prison walls. Whispers beyond the walls. For years, the prison walls kept secrets locked tight. But what happened in that kitchen couldn't stay hidden forever. It started small. A smuggled letter, written on scraps of paper hidden in a shoe. A phone call from the payphone. Rushed in whispered words before the line went dead. Families heard the same story over and over. They're starving us. They're feeding us rotten food. Men are collapsing. At first, no one believed it. Officials brushed it off as exaggeration. Reports were buried. But the whispers kept growing. One mother showed her son's letter to a lawyer. Another family contacted a local news reporter. Soon, journalists began asking questions the prison couldn't answer. Why were inmates losing so much weight? Why were medical visits increasing? Why were men describing the same punishment meal, the loaf? The prison tried to deny it, but the truth had a way of leaking out. Photos surfaced. Trays with slimy meat, moldy bread, cockroaches crawling across kitchen counters. Stories spread of men vomiting blood, of others surviving off toothpaste and tap water. The silence inside was finally breaking outside, and the world was beginning to watch. Retaliation, but exposure came with a price. The more the outside asked questions, the harsher life inside became. Guards tightened control. Inspections doubled. The kitchen was locked down. Meals grew even smaller, thinner. One scoop of rice, one slice of bread. Sometimes nothing but watery broth that looked like dirty dishwater. Prisoners grew weaker. Their eyes sank, their skin pale. Some begged for help, others cursed the guards, and a few simply gave up, curling on their bunks in silence. And yet, even in their weakness, something stronger was building. The inmates now knew the outside world was listening. One wrong move from the prison, one more death, and the story would explode. And it did. One morning, an inmate was found dead in his cell, a tray of untouched food by his side. Death on the tray. The body lay still on the bunk, pale and thin, with a tray of untouched food beside him. The loaf sat hard and gray. The soup congealed into a film. His stomach was empty, but his spirit was broken long before hunger finished the job. Guards tried to cover it up. They said it was natural causes. They claimed he refused medical treatment. But word spread fast. Inmates whispered his name through the bars, fists pounding against metal, a chorus of anger shaking the tier. The news leaked outside. A lawyer announced it at a press conference. A mother cried into cameras, holding up her son's last letter about the rotten food. Reporters swarmed the prison gates. "Is prison food killing inmates?" became the headline that couldn't be ignored. The system wanted silence, but silence was gone. And once the cameras started rolling, the truth was impossible to hide. National spotlight. Television screens lit up across the country. Families in the U.S., the U.K., and Canada watched grainy images of prison trays, moldy bread, spoiled meat, cockroaches crawling on counters. Former inmates stepped forward, their voices shaking but clear. They break you with food. That's how they control you. Politicians pretended to be shocked. Investigations were promised. Reporters dug deeper, exposing billion-dollar food contracts with companies that profited by cutting corners and serving slop. For the first time, the public saw what inmates had lived for years. Food not as nourishment, but as punishment. Meals that weren't designed to keep men alive, but to break their spirits. Inside, prisoners felt a flicker of hope. Their fight was finally reaching ears beyond the razor wire. But with that hope came fear, because everyone knew what happens when prisons feel cornered. The next move would not be mercy. It would be retaliation. The crackdown. The cameras outside the gates made the prison look weak. And inside, weakness is never allowed. The retaliation came fast. Guards stormed the tiers in the middle of the night, boots pounding like thunder, keys rattling, batons in hand. Inmates were yanked from bunks, slammed against walls, and dragged to solitary. The hunger strike leaders were the first targets. Shackled, blindfolded, they were thrown into freezing cells with nothing but a thin mattress and a single cold loaf shoved through the slot. No water, no blankets, just silence and concrete. For the rest of the prison, the message was clear. You want to fight with food? We'll make you starve. The meals got smaller. Sometimes a spoonful of beans. Sometimes just broth that tasted like salt water. Men begged for scraps, trading soap, clothes, even shoes for a stale piece of bread. The crackdown worked for some. Voices grew quieter. Energy faded. Hope drained away. But not everyone broke. A few still whispered in the dark, still planned, still dreamed. And when a system pushes too hard, it always risks one thing, a bigger explosion. The boiling point. The prison had turned into a graveyard of hunger and silence. But pressure doesn't disappear. It builds. One night, a kitchen worker, an inmate forced to cook the same rotten food, slipped something into a letter hidden under the flap. A photo. It showed what the kitchen really looked like. Piles of spoiled meat, rats on flour sacks, maggots writhing in the corners. That letter made it out. It hit the newspapers. And when the world saw the picture, outrage erupted like fire. Protesters gathered outside the prison gates, chanting with signs, "Food is a human right." Reporters camped outside. Lawyers demanded answers. Politicians called for hearings. And inside the prison, the inmates heard the noise through the walls. For the first time in years, hope felt real, but hope in prison is dangerous. Because the system never lets go without a fight. The walls tremble. The protests outside grew louder by the day. Families chanted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. The prison's walls shook not from force, but from the sound of the world finally watching. Inside, inmates pressed their ears to the windows, straining to hear the noise. Some whispered, "They're fighting for us." Others clenched fists and said, "Now it's our turn." The warden saw it differently. To him, the protests were an embarrassment, a sign of losing control. He doubled security, more guards, more lockdowns, meals cut to the bare minimum. But instead of calming things, it lit a fuse. Inmates felt the outside pressure and believed change was possible. They started refusing trays again, banging on doors in rhythm with the chants echoing outside. The prison was no longer sealed off. It was connected. Two worlds, the inside and the outside, moving together like thunder and lightning. And then came the spark that turned it all into a firestorm. The Riot of Fire. It began in the Chow hall once again, the place where every fight had started. A guard shoved a tray into an inmate's chest. The inmate shoved back. The tray hit the ground, food splattering across boots. The silence lasted only a second. Then the roar began. Tables flipped. Fists flew. Trays smashed against walls. But this time it was different. Someone grabbed a mop bucket filled with grease and lit it with a contraband lighter. Flames spread fast, licking up the walls, filling the air with black smoke. Guards rushed in with shields, but the fire forced them back. Inmates screamed through the smoke, some waving burning trays, others choking on the fumes. Outside, protesters saw the black clouds rising over the prison. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters shouted into microphones. The story had reached its breaking point. The prison food war had turned into a full-scale riot. The unbreakable. Even in the hunger, even in the silence, even in the cold, something refused to die. Some inmates began sharing what little they had. A crust of bread here, a sip of water there. Others scratched words into the walls. "We will not break." The message passed cell to cell, a quiet resistance no lockdown could erase. And then came the spark. Another letter slipped past the guards, hidden in legal mail. It told the story of the starvation tactic, the punishment loaf, the silent torture of meals that were never meant to feed. That letter made headlines. It broke the walls wide open. The story wasn't just about one prison anymore. It became about all prisons, across states, across countries, about how food, the most basic human need, was twisted into a weapon. And this time, the world wasn't just watching. It was demanding change. Change or illusion. The pressure was boiling over. Families held rallies. Lawyers filed lawsuits, and reporters broadcast every detail. For the first time in decades, prison food wasn't hidden shame. It was headline news. Politicians promised reforms. New contracts were announced. Menus were rewritten on paper, filled with promises of fresh vegetables, clean kitchens, and meals with dignity. Cameras toured prison cafeterias, showing steaming trays of pasta, crisp apples, and cartons of milk. To the public, it looked like victory. The system claimed it had changed. But inside the walls, the story was different. The shiny meals were for the cameras. After the spotlights left, the same gray loaf, the same watery beans, the same moldy bread returned. Inmates whispered bitterly, "Nothing has changed. It never does." Yet something had shifted, not in the food, but in the spirit. The inmates knew the world had heard them. Their silence had been broken. Their suffering was no longer invisible. And that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. The prison could still punish their bodies, but it could no longer erase their voices. Meals that break spirits. At the end of it all, the story of prison food wasn't about taste. It wasn't about money. It was about power. Meals were never meant to nourish. They were meant to control, to weaken, to break. Every loaf, every scoop of slop, every moldy slice of bread was a reminder of who held the keys. And yet, even in that control, cracks had formed. A single tray had sparked riots. A single photo had fueled protests. A single death had forced the world to look. Prison food broke spirits, but it also exposed the system. And sometimes, exposure is the first step toward change. The fight was not over. The question remained, would the world keep watching? Or would the meals go back to being served in silence, breaking spirits one tray at a time? The ghost of hunger. Even after the cameras left and the promises faded, hunger stayed. It haunted the cells like a ghost. Every tray that slid through the slot carried the same question. Will this meal feed me or break me? For some inmates, the fight was over. They ate in silence, eyes empty, spirits crushed by years of slop and starvation. But others refused to let the system win so easily. They shared stories with new arrivals, warning them of the loaf, of the hunger strikes, of the riots that had once turned the prison upside down. And in those whispers, something dangerous survived, memory. Because the system could change the menu, could repaint the chow hall, could deny everything on paper, but it could not erase what had already been lived. The ghost of hunger reminded every man inside that food was never just food. It was punishment. It was power. And ghosts don't go away. Food as a weapon, food as a voice. The phrase scratched into the wall. If food can break us, it can also free us. Spread cell to cell like wildfire. Inmates who once ate in silence began pushing back in small but powerful ways. Some refused their trays, sliding them back untouched to show they would no longer play by the prison's rules. Others saved scraps of bread and passed them from cell to cell, proving that even the smallest crumb could be shared in defiance. The kitchen workers, prisoners forced to cook the slop, became quiet rebels too. Some whispered warnings about spoiled meat. Others let trays slip out with extra food hidden beneath. Every small act was dangerous, but together they sent one message. We are not broken yet. Food, once used to punish and control, was slowly turning into the prisoner's voice. And that voice was growing louder. But voices inside don't rise without consequences. And soon, the prison struck back, harder than ever before. The last refusal. It started with a single tray. A guard slid it through the slot, a cold gray loaf on a paper plate. The inmate stared at it for a long moment, then pushed it back out, untouched. The next cell did the same. Then the next. Within minutes, an entire tier had refused. The guards barked orders, slammed batons against bars, but the message was clear. No one would eat. Not the loaf, not the slop, not the punishment disguised as food. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was unity. And unity terrified the system more than any riot ever could. By nightfall, the hunger strike had spread through the prison. Dozens of men lay weak in their bunks, their stomachs growling, but their eyes locked with each other in silent agreement. We will not break. The warden faced a choice. End the strike by force, or face the cameras when men started dying. The breaking point outside. Word leaked fast. Families called reporters. Lawyers rushed to file emergency appeals. Headlines lit up. Mass hunger strike behind bars. Prison food scandal explodes again. Outside, protests swelled larger than ever. Crowds chanted through megaphones, holding signs that read, "Starvation is torture and meals, not weapons." The pressure was suffocating. For the first time, state officials stepped in. Audits were launched. Emergency orders demanded inspections. The warden was dragged before microphones, sweating under the questions he couldn't answer. And inside, the inmates heard the news. Hope spread like fire through the tears. They had taken a weapon used against them, food, and turned it into the loudest protest a prison had ever seen. But hope is dangerous in prison, because when the system is cornered, it always fights back one last time. Starve or surrender. The warden's voice echoed through the intercom that night. You refuse to eat? Then you'll get nothing at all. And with that, the punishment loaf vanished. No trays, no broth, no food at all. Day 1 passed, then day 2. Inmates grew weak, their bodies trembling, their lips dry and cracked. Some collapsed in their cells, banging on the doors for water. Guards ignored them. Others tried to hold out, whispering encouragement to the vents. Don't give and don't break. By day 3, the prison was a tomb of silence, broken only by coughs and groans. The strike had become a war of survival, and everyone knew it couldn't last much longer. The turning tide. Just when it seemed the system would starve them into silence, the outside world struck harder. Video leaked from inside, smuggled footage of rotting meat in the kitchen, of trays crawling with bugs, of prisoners collapsing in their cells. It hit the evening news, unfiltered, undeniable. Outrage erupted across the country. Crowds gathered at state houses. Governors demanded resignations. Human rights lawyers called it a crime hidden in plain sight. And this time, the pressure worked. State officials ordered emergency food shipments, inspections, and an independent investigation. Guards, once defiant, now scrambled to clean kitchens, scrub walls, and hide evidence. Inside, the first trays of real food arrived: hot rice, beans, fruit, bread that wasn't moldy. For some, it felt like victory. For others, it felt like too little, too late. Because while the food changed for the moment, the question remained. Was this the beginning of reform or just another illusion? A taste of freedom. For the first time in years, the trays looked different. Real food, rice that didn't stink, beans that weren't sour, bread that was soft instead of moldy. Even an apple, its skin shining under the fluorescent lights. Prisoners stared in disbelief. Some devoured it instantly, chewing with tears in their eyes. Others refused, suspicious it was just another trick. The Chow hall was filled with silence, broken only by the sound of cautious chewing. For a brief moment, hope felt real. Men whispered that maybe the protest had worked, that maybe the world outside had finally forced the system to change. But in prison, hope always carries a shadow, because behind the walls, nothing is ever what it seems. The cycle returns. Weeks passed. The cameras left. The protest thinned. The officials who promised reform moved on to the next headline. And slowly, the trays began to change again. The rice returned watery. The beans turned bitter. The bread came stale. The apple was gone. Within months, the slop was back. The same gray loaf. The same punishment meals. The same silence filling the chow hall as trays slid through the slots. The prisoners knew then the system hadn't reformed. It had only hidden. Food was still a weapon. Meals were still used to break their spirits. And the cycle had begun again. But something had changed, too, not in the food, but in the voices. Because now the world outside knew. And once a truth escapes the walls, it never disappears. The seeds of a movement. The food inside had fallen back into the same cycle, rotten, stale, gray. But outside, the truth had already taken root. Activists used the leaked images in rallies. Law students studied the lawsuits as examples of systemic abuse. Families who once whispered in shame now shouted in protest. Meals are not weapons. For the first time, the fight over prison food stretched beyond single facilities. It spread to state capitals, to courtrooms, to human rights hearings in places as far as London and Toronto. Reports were written. Documentaries aired. The words prison food no longer meant slop hidden behind bars. It meant abuse, control, injustice. And even though the meals inside were still breaking spirits, the voices outside were getting louder, louder than the warden, Louder than the guards, louder than the walls themselves. Something was happening. Something the system had spent decades trying to prevent. The fear of the future. But with every movement comes fear. Officials worried what would happen if the public saw prisons not as places of order, but as factories of cruelty. Private food companies worried their contracts, worth millions, would vanish under scrutiny. Wardens feared losing the one weapon they relied on most, hunger. So the system shifted tactics. Not open starvation this time, not the loaf. Instead, it hid behind words, balanced diets, budget-friendly meals, state-approved nutrition. On paper, it looked reformed. On trays, it was the same misery dressed differently. But the inmates had learned something important. The public was listening now. And once people started to listen, they don't unhear the truth. The fear wasn't just inside the prisons anymore. It had reached the offices of those who ran them. And for the first time, the system itself was trembling. The showdown, the battle over food, was no longer hidden in chow halls or solitary cells. It was in courtrooms, on protest signs, across news screens. What started with spoiled meat and punishment loaves had grown into something far larger, a fight for human dignity itself. Inside, the meals were still tools of control. Outside, they had become symbols of injustice. The system tried to cover, to spin, to silence, but truth had already slipped through the cracks. Every leaked photo, every smuggled letter, every collapsed body in the yard had built a story too big to bury. And though the prison still held the keys, they no longer held the silence. After the fire, the world had seen the headlines, the protests, the court hearings. But when the cameras left, the prison stayed the same. Inside, the food still came on gray trays, the loaf still appeared in solitary, and silence still weighed heavier than chains. The fire of outrage outside had cooled, but the embers inside still burned. Former inmates released into the world carried the ghost of hunger with them. They spoke in halfway houses, in community centers, in church basements, telling stories of moldy bread, spoiled meat, and punishment meals that broke more than just bodies. Their words spread like sparks. Each testimony was another crack in the walls, another reminder that the fight wasn't over, because the truth about prison food was no longer just about what happened inside. It was about what it revealed outside, a system that saw hunger not as tragedy, but as a tool. And now, that truth lived in the open, impossible to erase. Voices beyond the walls. The men who walked out of prison carried more than scars. They carried memories of hunger, the smell of spoiled meat, the taste of the loaf, the sound of trays slamming in protest. Some tried to forget, but others couldn't stay silent. At town halls, they stood before microphones, their voices trembling but steady. I wasn't just locked up. I was starved. I was fed food that made me sick. They used meals to break me. Families listened. Communities listened. Reporters scribbled every word. Slowly, the stigma began to crack. Prisoners weren't just criminals in cages. They were human beings who had endured cruelty most people couldn't imagine. Nonprofits took notice. Advocacy groups formed campaigns. Prison food is human rights and stop the loaf. College students carried signs. Human rights lawyers gathered evidence. For the first time, the fight over meals wasn't just inside prison walls. It was alive in city streets, in classrooms, in the hearts of people who had never seen a cell. And the louder these voices grew, the more dangerous they became, because the system had survived by keeping them silent. The counterattack. The louder the voices grew, the harder the system struck back. Officials called the testimonies exaggerations. Reports of moldy bread and spoiled meat were dismissed as isolated incidents. Politicians shook hands on camera, promising investigations that quietly went nowhere. Behind closed doors, contracts with food companies were quietly renewed. Millions of dollars still flowed to the same suppliers who cut corners and pocketed profits. On paper, everything looked compliant. In reality, nothing had changed. But the counterattack didn't stop outside. Inside the prisons, retaliation was brutal. Inmates caught whispering about hunger strikes were sent to solitary. Kitchen workers who tried to sneak out evidence were threatened with extra years. Guards taunted prisoners during mealtimes, saying, "Your friends outside can't save you in here." The message was clear. The system wasn't afraid of riots. It was afraid of exposure. And now, it was determined to choke that exposure at its source. Yet, in trying to bury the truth, the system made one mistake. It forgot that the world had already seen the cracks. And cracks, once visible, only grow wider. Cracks that spread. The cover-ups worked for a while. Officials spoke polished words, waved stacks of papers, and pointed to compliance charts that showed nothing was wrong. On the surface, it looked like the storm had passed. But beneath, the cracks spread. Journalists dug deeper, uncovering contracts worth millions with companies already fined for serving spoiled food to schools and hospitals. Whistleblowers leaked emails from wardens who wrote things like, "The loaf works. It keeps them in line." Families refused to stay quiet. They organized marches outside courthouses, holding up trays filled with rotten bread and slimy beans to show the world what their loved ones were fed. And then came the tipping point, a leaked inspection photo. It showed a prison freezer filled with boxes stamped, "Not for human consumption," meat that had been served to inmates for months. The image went viral. Within hours, it was everywhere. News feeds, talk shows, hashtags trending across the U.S., the UK, and Canada. Hashtag meals that break spirits. The silence was broken. The system could no longer hide behind words. But exposure alone wasn't enough. The real question was, would it finally lead to change, or would the cycle repeat once? The fallout. The photo of the freezer spread faster than the system could react. Millions saw it. Anchors on nightly news shook their heads in disbelief. Politicians who once stayed silent were suddenly demanding answers. The companies behind the food contract scrambled. They issued statements blaming mistakes in supply chains. Wardens claimed they didn't know. Guards muttered about being scapegoats. But the world wasn't buying it anymore. Families filled the streets. Protesters carried trays painted with black mold, chanting, "Food is not punishment." College campuses organized teach-ins. Human rights groups filed lawsuits in multiple states. Inside, prisoners heard the echoes through the walls. For the first time, the chants outside sounded louder than the guards inside. Hope flickered again. But the system was cornered. And when the system feels cornered, it doesn't surrender. It retaliates. The next move wouldn't be about food at all. It would be about breaking the will of everyone watching. The final retaliation. The system had been exposed. The viral photo, the protests, the lawsuits, it all threatened to rip the mask away. And so, the retaliation came swift, calculated, and cruel. Inside, prisons went on total lockdown. Lights burned 24 hours a day. Visits were cut, phone calls slashed, mail censored. Guards stormed the tiers at night, dragging out anyone suspected of leading hunger strikes or smuggling letters. The food became punishment again, sharper than ever. Trays shrank to almost nothing. The loaf returned, hard, gray, tasteless. But now it came with a warning. This is all you'll get until you stop talking. Outside, the counterattack was quieter, but just as ruthless. Politicians labeled the protests dangerous. News outlets sympathetic to the system painted inmates as liars who complained about free meals. Lobbyists poured money into campaigns, insisting prison food was nutritionally sound. It was a two-front war, inside with hunger, outside with lies. But the system underestimated one thing. Once truth escapes, it doesn't die. Because even under lockdown, even with punishments harsher than ever, whispers still pass from cell to cell. And outside, voices grew louder, not quieter. The battle over prison food had become something bigger, not just about meals, but about humanity itself. The tipping point. The prisons thought they could silence the storm. They locked doors, censored mail, cut visits, and tightened fists around every tray of food. But silence didn't return. Because outside, the world had changed. The photo of the freezer, the testimonies, the marches, they had cracked something open that couldn't be sealed again. Human rights groups demanded federal oversight. Lawmakers faced pressure from voters who had seen the truth on their screens. Journalists camped at prison gates, refusing to move. International observers asked questions that officials could no longer dodge, and inside the walls, prisoners felt it. Each tray of watery beans, each loaf shoved through the slot, no longer just meant punishment. It meant proof. Proof that the system was what they said it was, a machine that used food not to feed, but to break. The warden ordered more lockdowns, more punishment meals, but it didn't matter. The truth was already louder than the guards. For the first time in decades, the question wasn't whether prison food could break spirits. It was whether broken spirits could finally break the system, bend or break. The pressure on the system was crushing. Court hearings piled up, families filled streets, and international headlines refused to fade. Every new image of rotten food, every new testimony of starvation made the public angrier. Officials face a choice they can no longer avoid: bend toward reform, or let the entire system break under its own weight. For the first time, independent inspectors were allowed inside. Cameras rolled through kitchens once hidden. They caught everything: expired cans stacked high, insects crawling near sinks, freezers filled with meat stamped not for human consumption. The footage was undeniable. The public demanded action. Politicians who once ignored the issue now rushed to pass prison food reform acts. Promises of fresh vegetables, real meat, and oversight committees filled the news. Inside, the first new shipments arrived: apples, cartons of milk, even trays of pasta. Inmates stared at them in disbelief, some too afraid to eat, others laughing bitterly. Was this real change, or just another performance of the cameras? Because behind every reform was the same question inmates had asked for years. When the cameras leave, will the food go back to breaking us again? The cycle or the change? For a while, it looked different. The trays carried apples, cartons of milk, soft bread, and rice that didn't stink. Inspectors made surprise visits. Politicians gave speeches. Families felt relief. But inside, the men who had lived through years of hunger and punishment didn't trust it. They'd seen this before: the camera food, the show meals, the promises that faded the moment attention turned elsewhere. And slowly, the cracks appeared again. Vegetables grew scarce. Apples vanished. Bread went stale. And in some prisons, the gray loaf returned, sliding through the slot in silence. The truth was bitter. Food in prison was never just about meals. It was about power. And power never gives up easily. But now the world knew. The silence was gone. Every tray of slop, every hunger strike, every riot over food was part of a story too large to bury again. The system might keep fighting to hide it, but the truth had already escaped. Meals that break spirits. Prison food was never simply food. It was a weapon, a tool designed to weaken bodies, to control minds, to break human spirits. For decades, gray loaves and moldy bread told men they were less than human. But in trying to starve them into silence, the system exposed itself. Because hunger doesn't just destroy. Hunger remembers. Hunger testifies. Hunger breaks the walls of secrecy. And now, the world has seen what happens behind bars. How meals meant to sustain became weapons to punish. So the question is no longer what happens inside. The question is, will we keep watching or let the silence return one tray at a time?